to this talk. I hope it is of interest, although it is pushing us into the Hellenistic period more than we have been so far. Herodotus is the origin of it all. So the argument I'm presenting today is part of a larger study of the legend that grew up around Sesostris, the conqueror king who embodied the acme of pharaonic history for the Greco-Roman world. For those of you who are not as acquainted with Sesostris as I have come to be over the years, the figure is loosely based on the historical pharaohs named Senwosret of the Egyptian 12th dynasty, which we date to about 1980 to 1770 BCE. The line from these historical pharaohs to the later tradition that compressed them into one exceptional king is indistinct and indirect. For instance, it is undoubtedly the case that the deeds of other pharaohs contributed to the Sesostris legend, especially the great conquerors of the New Kingdom. But I believe that certain elements of 12th dynasty culture were fundamental for ensuring that Sesostris was considered Egypt's most representative pharaoh by Greeks and Romans. In particular, several text types that seem to be constructing a self-conscious narrative about the past appear for the first time in this period of Egyptian literary history. Thus, Herodotus may not be wrong to say that the Egyptian priests were unable to report any significant deeds for the pharaohs who ruled after the founder Min, but before Moris, that is Amenemhat III, the son of Senwosret III, and of course Sesostris himself, who is the first pharaoh to receive an extended logos in the second half of Book 2. And you can see how Herodotus himself puts it at handout 1. While the legend of Sesostris began and developed in Egyptian culture of the New Kingdom in late period, the Sesostris character enters Greek literature with Herodotus, and his account of a world conqueror who left a significant mark on Egypt through his construction projects, irrigation works, and land reform, who scattered monuments throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, and who founded the city of Colchis on the Black Sea, became a touchstone of the Greek view of Egyptian history. Today, I consider 4 instances of the Ptolemaic reception of the Sesostris character that may be tied to Ptolemy III Euergetes, and which respond to Herodotus's logos in various ways. The first 2 cases are made possible by Herodotus's claim that the Colchians descended from Sesostris's army, but I argue that they use this Herodotean fact to create foundation narratives with different affiliations in Greek and Egyptian tradition. While Apollonius of Rhodes uses the Egyptian origins of Colchis to explore traditional Greek foundation myths in the Argonautica, what may be a suppressed version of the foundation myth of the Alexandrian Sarapis cult uses the same Herodotean fact to create a traditionally Egyptian story of a returning cult statue. I call this a suppressed version of the foundation myth since, the key to understanding the returning statue narrative is Sesostris, who appears in the 2 less canonical sources for the story, that is Clement of Alexandria's Protrepticus and the Alpha version of the Greek Alexander Romance. The classic Roman imperial account is the one of Tacitus and Plutarch, but I suggest that this version was not completely created in the Roman imperial period. Rather, it represents an edited version of a Ptolemaic story that minimized the cult's old Egyptian history and consequently Sesostris. Finally, I turn to Eratosthenes' brief account of Sesostris's Red Sea pillar and Tacitus's excursus on the Phoenix to investigate whether the Ptolemaic Sesostris can be linked specifically to Ptolemy III Euergetes, a Macedonian pharaoh who might have had the best military claim to being a new Sesostris. The argument that I present today is based on assembling fragments and reading later Roman imperial texts with an eye on the Hellenistic period, as is so often the case in studies of Ptolemaic culture. My picture is thus only one possible reconstruction, but I think that it helps us understand one specific aspect of the Hellenistic reception of Herodotus, and particularly how his Sesostris was useful for the Ptolemies. In doing so, I hope to deepen the recent work done on the Hellenistic Herodotus by scholars like Jessica Priestley and Andrew Morrison. In many studies of Ptolemaic Egypt that address the bicultural policies and cultural gestures of the Macedonian pharaohs, scholars have reached for powerful metaphors that illustrate a relationship of together but separate. For Ludwig Koenen, the Ptolemaic kingdom has a Janus head that looks to Egyptian subjects in one direction, the Greeks in the other. For Daniel Selden and Susan Stevens, Greek literature of the Ptolemaic court is designed to allow double readings facilitated by an Egyptian way of thought, whereby two contradictory concepts can exist within the same entity. According to this interpretation, some examples of Alexandrian poetry can be read from both Greek and Egyptian perspectives, that is, seeing double, to produce an extra resonant text. Both of these influential metaphors conceptualize Greek and Egyptian as separate traditions with mostly different audiences and ways of producing meaning. The Sesostris legend, however, existed in both Greek and Egyptian traditions before the Macedonians came to Egypt. There was a Greek Sesostris, as apparently first instantiated by Herodotus, and an Egyptian Sesostris who lived in the Egyptian literary tradition and its larger culture. While they were essentially the same figure, and Herodotus likely derived his picture of Sesostris from Egyptian sources to some extent, the Greek and Egyptian Sesostrises had separate lives, as Herodotus's Egyptian pharaoh was received by the Greek tradition, and the Egyptian tradition continued to develop on its own path. The Ptolemies, I suggest, used this situation to marshal a Ptolemaic through empire. Sesostris was available as a truly multicultural figure from the beginning. He was at home in Egyptian, Greek, and Ptolemaic culture, and no covert double readings were necessary to grasp his Greco-Egyptian power. Returning now to the text, it is noteworthy that while the broad outlines of Herodotus' Sesostris as world conqueror and culture hero are essential for the later Greek tradition, the Colchis connection appears prominently in the Hellenistic sources, although they are admittedly few and may not be fully representative. To refresh your memory, I have the Herodotean passage at handout 2, which precedes the infamous discussion of Egyptian and Colchian circumcision. Here, Herodotus expresses uncertainty about how intentional the foundation was, noting, "I'm not able to say precisely what happened then, whether King Sesostris himself separated off a part of his own army and left them there as inhabitants of the land, or whether some of the soldiers were annoyed by his roaming and remained around the Phasis River." But while he concedes that the Colchians appeared to remember their Egyptian descent more than the Egyptians, he claims that Egyptian sources appear to have supported the link between Colchis and Sesostris' army. The only extant reference to Sesostris in Alexandrian poetry comes in the Argonautica, Apollonius of Rhodes' circumscribed epic on the pan-Hellenic quest into the deepest recess of the Black Sea that brought Medea to Greece. And this is handout 3. As the Greek heroes are trying to make their way out of the Black Sea with stolen goods while pursued by angry Colchians, Argos, the Colchian prince with a Greek father, informs them that there is an alternate way back to Greece from the Black Sea that was etched on pillars, kerbies, by the old Egyptians who were led to Colchis by a world conqueror. Apollonius refrains from mentioning the pharaoh's name, having Argos refer only to someone from there, that is, Egypt, Enthendatina, who traveled around through all Europe and Asia, relying on force, the strength of his people, and excellence. Along his way, he founded countless towns, some of which are inhabited, others are not, for a very great period of time has passed. But still now, Aya, that is Colchis, remained steadfast, as well as the descendants of those men whom he settled there to inhabit Aya. They save their father's writings, pillars on which are all the paths and boundaries of the water and dry land for those who travel around. Already the scholiast to this passage identified the someone as Sesostris, and the Egyptian conqueror of Europe and Asia is recognizably Herodotus' pharaoh. As many have noted, the kerbies, inscribed with arcane and indeed physically impossible geography, respond to the stele Herodotus claims Sesostris set up and inscribed with sexualized remarks on the bravery or cowardice of his opponents. And just to reassure you, the impossible route is there underlined in yellow. That is, there's no river between the Black Sea and the coast. Interestingly, however, while Herodotus is unsure whether Sesostris founded Colchis and does not attribute any further foreign colonization to him, Apollonius implies that this is one of the pharaoh's many foundations, Moria d'Aste, which he planted along his route in the manner of Hercules, Megasthenes Dionysus, or, as several scholars have noted, Alexander the Great. Thus, Apollonius solves the Herodotean question by updating Sesostris as a particularly Hellenistic conqueror-founder. By this, I mean that even though Sesostris is a figure from Egypt's past, the idea of overseas colonization by the king never appears in extant pharaonic literature or other media. Thus, Apollonius's picture is both very Hellenistic and very Greek. While there is a lot going on in this passage, I focus our discussion today on the cultural affiliations and larger implications of its foundation narrative. Several scholars have recognized this episode as an attempt to give an Egyptian background to a fundamental Greek myth that also had important resonances for Ptolemaic Egypt. Susan Stevens, in particular, has developed a complex position in several articles. Most broadly, Stevens argues that by invoking the early episodes from foundation myths about the island of Thera, the city of Cyrene, and Libyan cities more generally, Apollonius provides an Egyptianizing foundation myth for Greco-Macedonian presence in North Africa and Alexandria in particular. In her view, Apollonius builds upon the version of these myths that were told as part of the Argonaut story by Herodotus in Book 4 and Pindar in Pythian 4, even though Apollonius's audience must fill in the mythical steps that connect Thera to Alexandria from external knowledge of Herodotus and Pindar. In both authors, descendants of the Argonauts were divinely authorized to inhabit the continent of Libya, which includes the future site of Alexandria. By piggybacking on their foundation myth, Apollonius can produce a divinely authorized Greek claim to a significant part of Egyptian land. Stevens further suggests that Jason's plowing of Colchian soil and his union with the half-Egyptian Medea anticipates and confers legitimacy on the Argonauts' descendants, who were to settle North Africa. As intriguing as this argument is, we may wonder how effective this paradigm could have been, since the children of Jason and Medea themselves did not survive Euripides' play. A further Egypto-Colchian connection explored by Stevens and present in both Argonautica 4 and the Anaphe Aition in Callimachus's first Aitia, seems more promising for the distant Egyptian ancestry of the Ptolemaic aristocracy. The Egyptian-descended Colchians who settled in Epirus and Illyria, instead of returning home after their failed pursuit of the Argonauts, could be deemed distant ancestors of Macedonian rulers of Egypt, such as Alexander, whose mother Olympias was from Epirus. Morrison has recently pushed back against Stevens' arguments from several directions, all deriving from Apollonius's use of Herodotus's histories. These are the fact that the poem hints in a very complex way at a connection between the Argonauts and Alexandria, unlike a true Ctesias, that Apollonius seems to affiliate his text more closely with Herodotus than Pindar in the Libyan foundation, that Herodotus provides Apollonius with a complex model of ethnic and cultural differences, and finally, that Argos's description of Egypt plays down its Egyptian identity, thus obscuring a connection between Sesostris's Egypt and Hellenistic Egypt. In particular, Morrison stresses that when Argos calls Egypt Ieria and the Nile Triton, Sesostris's land is placed in the far distant past before the country got its contemporary name and before most Greek ethnoi existed. Thus, Argos uses the topos of Egypt's great antiquity that is also used by Herodotus. Yet, according to Herodotus, Sesostris ruled only 2 generations before Proteus, the pharaoh who guarded Helen while her eidolon went to Troy. If we follow the Herodotean chronology, Sesostris belongs either to the generation of Aietes' father or perhaps his grandfather. While we could wonder whether an audience familiar with Herodotus might briefly imagine that Sesostris and his soldiers founded Colchis quite recently, even that Sesostris himself installed Aietes' family in power, Argos points out that a very great amount of time, polus aion, has passed since the Egyptian presence, so much that some of Sesostris's towns have disappeared. Morrison may indeed be correct to express reservations about some of the Egyptian background Apollonius's Sesostris story provides for Ptolemaic Egypt, though I am quite convinced that Colchian settlement in Illyria and Epirus provides a plausible link between the Egypto-Colchians and the Macedonian aristocracy. But if we leave these reservations momentarily to the side and assume that Apollonius connects Egyptian Colchis with Libyan Alexandria through the myths of Thera and Cyrene, I believe we can analyze it as a Ptolemaic foundation myth that is primarily constructed from Greek cultural codes, even though it is built around a very small, authentic Egyptian core. First, as discussed above, the connections between the Argonauts, Thera, Cyrene, and Libya are hinted at through a rarefied, elusive strategy that requires knowledge of the Greek classics and the narrative patterns of Greek city foundation to be understood. Second, the Argonautica Sesostris is a Herodotean figure updated for the Hellenistic period through the model of Alexander. He is thus a product of the Greek Sesostris tradition that responded to Herodotus. Yet the very fact that the Greek Sesostris originates in Herodotus's histories gives him more truly Egyptian credentials than a founder figure from Greek myths about Egypt, such as Io or Aegyptus. Indeed, some of Apollonius's audience may have known that Sesostris represents an authentic Egyptian view of pharaonic history that was still alive in demotic literature and Egyptian cult. If, however, we return to skepticism and discard a possible application of the Egyptian foundation of Colchis for Ptolemaic Alexandria specifically, we might see that Apollonius is inserting a small, authentically Egyptian element into the Greek cultural narrative in a different way. By conveniently ignoring the Herodotean chronology and situating Sesostris in a fairy tale Ierie that existed before Greek culture and, in a sense, outside of historical time, Apollonius can embed him more easily and securely within the Argonaut myth, thus giving Sesostris a position in the corpus of core Greek myths that was held by no other pharaoh with a Herodotean claim to historicity, except, of course, Proteus, who was pharaoh during the Trojan War. Thus, Apollonius creates a character of Greek myth from a historical Egyptian pharaoh. Proteus, indeed, had experienced the opposite of this process, since he was a figure of Greek myth who was transformed into an Egyptian pharaoh. We may wonder whether Apollonius's reluctance to name Sesostris in his epic reflects a sense of caution in what may have been considered a radical cultural move. But as far as we can tell from Valerius Flaccus's Roman Imperial Argonautica, Sesostris's Colchian foundation became a fixture of the Argonauts' story. Valerius Flaccus even mentions Sesostris by name. With this Ptolemaic and culturally Greek adaptation of the Herodotean Sesostris in mind, I now turn to an investigation of the sources for the foundation narrative of the Alexandrian Sarapis cult that is motivated, as ever, by Sesostris. I suggest that we can uncover a story that uses the Greek idea of a founder king within an Egyptian narrative pattern. This results in a Ptolemaic foundation story that is more affiliated with Egyptian culture, though built around a Greek core. In laying out my argument, I survey a number of dense passages relatively quickly in the interest of time, and I hope that we can return to more of their details in the discussion. I also leave aside the historical questions of when exactly the Alexandrian Sarapis cult was created, only pointing out two relatively certain facts. First, although the cult of Serapis was created by the Ptolemies, he was conceived as the Greek equivalent of a pre-existing Egyptian figure, the deceased Apis bull called Osiris Apis, who was already venerated by the old Hellenic community in Memphis. Second, while there is inscriptional evidence for worship of Serapis in Alexandria from the reigns of Ptolemy I and II, the foundation plaques found at the site of the Alexandrian Sarapis herald Ptolemy III as its builder. We will come back to both these points later in the discussion. The sources for the foundation narrative of the Alexandrian Sarapis cult present a particular challenge for those seeking its possible Ptolemaic form. They all date to the Roman period and are thus inevitably colored by the perspectives of their post-Hellenistic authors and the history and reception of the Serapis cult in the Mediterranean over the course of centuries. Furthermore, these sources present at least 10 separate foundation stories. While the Roman period texts have not been completely passed over in attempts to construct the cult's early history in the late 4th and early 3rd centuries BCE, the current consensus places the foundation story no earlier than when Tacitus chose to mention it in his histories, that is, Vespasian's iconic visit to Alexandria where he was hailed emperor in 69 CE. This approach avoids the methodological problems of plundering a later text for an earlier one, as well as the pitfalls of positivism, but it fails to take full account of evidence from the Hellenistic period, which creates a rich context for the extant material, and which has been significantly expanded by discoveries made over the last several decades. In particular, I mean narratives that belong to the world of Greco-Roman Egypt, such as the Dream of Nectanebo, the Oracle of the Potter, and letters from the Xenon archive. While scholars have pointed out connections between Tacitus and this material, dating the story he relates to the Roman imperial period does not allow Egyptian culture to have played a serious role in the initial creation of a central Ptolemaic institution. Instead, it follows what I see as a Roman attempt to minimize Egyptian content in the foundation story of what was a popular cult of the Roman Empire. In this section, I argue that by analyzing canonical and non-canonical sources for the foundation of the Alexandrian Sarapis cult together, as testaments to an earlier tradition, we can identify a plausible story that combined Greek and Egyptian narrative patterns in the Ptolemaic period. This analysis and the story were made possible by the Herodotean Sesostris. I begin with the canonical version of the story that is preserved in the high-status testimony of Tacitus and Plutarch. This account, as we shall see, reflects Roman editing in its elision of Egyptian content from its account of the cult's foundation. Although Plutarch presents several different details, I focus here on Tacitus' account, which is the fullest and conveys the main structure of the tale, and this account is found at handout 4. In Tacitus' story, Ptolemy Soter receives a dream ordering him to collect a statue from Pontus. Research is done into the meaning of the dream. The Egyptian priests fail, and so the Eumolpid Timotheus is summoned from Eleusis. He finds out that the dream concerns Sinope and the god Jove Dis. Despite this knowledge, Ptolemy gets distracted. He is, however, reminded of the statue by threatening dreams and sends envoys to King Skidrothemis in Scythia. The Ptolemaic envoys make a stop at Delphi for important instructions. Skidrothemis delays his decision for 3 years until he is persuaded to act by threatening divine signs. Then he summons an assembly of the people who do not want to give up the statue. Heedless of the Sinopeans' displeasure, the statue makes its way to Egypt of its own accord, and a temple is built in the district of Rakotis in Alexandria, apparently next to an old shrine of Isis and Serapis. As I mentioned, the current consensus connects the story to Vespasian's visit to Alexandria and suggests that its author was Appian, the 1st century CE Alexandrian grammarian, poet, and author of an Egyptiaca, whose work and behavior was attacked by Josephus and against Appian because of its extreme hostility toward the Jews. Appian would thus have created the Serapis and Sinope story as a display of erudition, perhaps to pay tribute in some way to the Flavian dynasty's installation on the Roman throne and its interest in the Egyptian cults. Since there is no evidence for worship of Serapis and Sinope until the Roman imperial period, scholars have explained the presence of the name in the story by a hill in Memphis called Sinopion, which was equated to a place called Set-ten-Hep, the place of Apis, perhaps pronounced something like Sehenep. The hill Sinopion is, however, only mentioned in the Alpha recension of the Alexander Romance and Eustathius Scholia to Dionysius Periegetes. It is more than possible that the connection between the hill and Sinope happened the other way around, and that the Greek toponym Sinopion was a late invention that reflected the Serapis foundation story. The narrative pattern which underlies Tacitus' story, and which consists of a dream, delay, and finally, unilateral and divinely motivated royal action, has in fact been long recognized as what has been called an Egyptian Königsnovelle, and it is now mostly agreed that the narrative Tacitus is telling has its origins in Egyptian narrative forms. The term Königsnovelle was coined by the Egyptologist Alfred Hermann in a short but influential monograph of 1938. In the first half of his essay, he describes it as a form of pharaonic historiography, which took the form of monumental inscriptions that recounted a decision taken by the pharaoh, which results in some benefit for Egypt, such as rebuilding a temple or expelling of invaders. In the second half, Hermann discussed later legendary versions and Königsnovelle adjacent forms, which included important late period texts such as the Bentrach Stele, the Dream of Nectanebo, and Tacitus's own narrative of Serapis. The term Königsnovelle has become quite controversial, and I will not discuss how many parts of Hermann's analysis have been modified, not least because of advances in Egyptology and the discovery of more evidence for Greco-Egyptian literature. It is, however, undoubtedly the case that the narrative pattern was used by historians like Herodotus, Manetho, and Josephus, and that similar narrative forms were used in the late period texts mentioned by Hermann and others like them. In particular, Ludwig Koenen compared the Tacitus Serapis story to the Dream of Nectanebo, and more recently, Stanley Burstein has returned to connections between Tacitus and the Bentrach story. While we do not have time to go through a detailed comparison, I will present the outline of the narrative of both texts, and I believe the similarities should mostly speak for themselves. The Dream of Nectanebo, or Prophecy of Ptolemy narrative, is, is now attested by Greek and Demotic papyri, one of which presents a terminus antiquem for this tradition, since it derives from the papers of the sons of Glaucias, who lived in the Memphite Serapeum in Saqqara in the first half of the 2nd century BCE. In this story, Nectanebo II, the last native Egyptian pharaoh, has a dream in which he learns that the god Onuris, that is, Ares, is furious because his temple has not been completed. Nectanebo accordingly investigates what remains to be done, and a hieroglyph cutter named Ptizis is commissioned to complete the outstanding inscriptions. Unfortunately, Ptizis is distracted by wine and a woman, and his failure to complete his work leads to the foreign invasion of Egypt. Given the pattern of Egyptian prophecy and the Nectanebo episode that begins the Alexander romance, Kim Ryholt has plausibly argued that the sequel to the dream story that is preserved in several demotic writing exercises ended with the proclamation or prophecy of Alexander the Great as Nectanebo's son and savior of Egypt. If this reconstruction is correct, both the Serapis and Nectanebo stories would result in Egyptian success, even after human weakness slowed the completion of divine commands, thus making their narrative arcs similar. Indeed, we have evidence that a similar narrative pattern of dream, delay, and forcible divine persuasion influenced the stories told by private individuals about the creation of new Serapeia throughout the Mediterranean in the early Ptolemaic period. The best example is provided by a certain Zoilos of Aspendos in a famous letter of 257 BCE, which he wrote to Apollonius, the Euergetes of Ptolemy II, and that forms part of the Xenon archive. And this is the text at handout 8. Sorry, these are clearly out of order. In this letter, Zoilos urges Apollonius to construct a Serapeum in the Greek neighborhood of what is probably Memphis to complement the old Egyptian shrine of the Osiris Apis bull located 4 miles west in Saqqara. In addition to being more convenient to the city, this shrine may also have provided a Greek instantiation of the Serapis cult. In his attempt to persuade Apollonius, however, Zoilos does not stress these potentially very cogent reasons. Instead, he explains in detail how his letter resulted from a dream from Serapis, followed by 2 delays that provoked dire punishment. Since this narrative is the main persuasive material of the letter, we might imagine that it must have carried some considerable external authority. Other elements of Tacitus's story seem to have unmistakable antecedents in a slightly different Königsnovelle narrative pattern. In particular, the Bentrach story is an Egyptian narrative about divine statues and their travels that looks strikingly similar to the later parts of Tacitus's account. This story is preserved on 2 hieroglyphic inscriptions from Egyptian temples and likely dates to the early Ptolemaic period, although this is controversial. In this story, the pharaoh Ramses marries a princess from Bakhtan. One day, a messenger arrives from Bakhtan saying that the Egyptian queen's sister, Bentrach, is very sick and requesting Egyptian help. An Egyptian sage is sent to Bakhtan to diagnose Bentrach, and he requests that Ramses send a god to heal her. Ramses consults with Khonsu in Thebes and is granted permission to send the god to Bakhtan. The god makes the trip, and the physical details of giving him a boat, a chariot, and horses suggest that a statue is being transported. The god heals Bentrash, and the prince of Bakhtan conspires to keep this powerful divinity in his realm. The god is kept in Bakhtan for 3 years and 9 months until the prince receives a terrifying dream. Warned in this way, he sends the god back to Egypt with many gifts. The Bentrash story appears to use the popular Egyptian theme of divine images in involuntary exile among Eastern enemies, even if the statue of Khons was sent east by the Egyptian king and not taken as a spoil of war, as in many texts of late-period Egyptian literature. The Ptolemies enthusiastically embraced the related narrative topos of returning plundered Egyptian statues in their royal inscriptions, whether or not they actually repatriated stolen art in the course of the Syrian wars they fought against the Seleucids. Ptolemy Soter already makes a claim of returning Egyptian statues in the hieroglyphic satrap stele that was set up in 311 BCE, while Alexander the Great's son, Alexander IV, technically still ruled Egypt. The motif was further used in some of the most significant documents of Ptolemaic history issued by various Ptolemies, including the Pithom stele, the Adulis inscription, the Canopus decree, and the Memphis decree. It seems thus to have been well known and used in early Hellenistic Egypt. Now let's return to the Serapis story with these narrative patterns in mind. While elements of both the Nectanebo and Bentrash narrative patterns are at work in Tacitus's story, these parallels also point to a question. If the Serapis narrative is using the theme of returning divine images from the east to Egypt, why isn't Serapis described as an Egyptian god in exile? My answer, you may not be surprised to hear, is that the Sesostris variants of the foundation story provide the context that we have in the Bentrash story, but are missing in the Tacitus and Plutarch version. The cult of the statue in exile was actually an old Egyptian one connected to a very powerful legendary pharaoh. Thus, I now turn to the two sources for the foundation of the Alexandrian Sarapis cult that feature Sesostris. Both of these texts have traditionally held a lower status in the world of Greco-Roman antiquity and classical scholarship, and their Egyptian associations may have influenced or allowed their retention of the Sesostris character. It is my claim, however, that it is possible to make a coherent whole out of the separated parts of these stories, and moreover, that such a reconstruction is necessary to make sense of the narrative. First, we turn to Clement of Alexandria, who quotes the 1st century BCE Stoic philosopher Athenodorus of Tarsus in support of his claim that Serapis was a man-made fabrication who lacks the authority of the Christian God, and this is handout 5. According to Clement, Athenodorus wrote that the craftsman of the Serapis statue was a certain Greek named Bryaxis, who was invited, or perhaps brought, to Egypt by Sesostris after he conquered Greece. If the quotation is reliable, which I assume it is, Athenodorus is the earliest extant source to link the characteristically Ptolemaic Serapis cult with Sesostris, giving it a different kind of Greco-Egyptian pedigree in the process. On the Egyptian side, a significant feature of the cult was instituted by a famous dynastic pharaoh, and his statue was originally created to be Osiris, Serapis's Egyptian avatar. The craftsman was, however, a Greek who presumably applied Greek techniques to his sculpture, even if its materials are distinctively Egyptian. Interestingly, Sesostris is imagined to have done exactly what Ptolemy Soter did in creating Serapis. Namely, he produced a new version of the old Egyptian god Osiris. While Athenodorus does not appear to mention the Black Sea connection, Sesostris is a particularly appropriate pharaoh to associate with Serapis, since the Herodotean Sesostris colonized Colchis and could plausibly have operated in the greater Black Sea area. The possibility of such a connection between Sesostris's foundation of Colchis and the cult of Serapis could even be inferred from a fragment from the Victoria Berenike of Callimachus's Aitia. In this fragment, we first hear of Colchians or the Nile, followed 2 lines later by women skilled in bewailing the white-spotted bull, an allusion to the death of the Apis bull. It is tempting to find here the elements of a reference to Sesostris and the Sarapis cult, as Callimachus refers to the Colchians' Egyptian connection, and then provides a learned periphrasis on the Egyptian origins and traditions of the Serapis cult. The present state of the evidence does not allow firm conclusions to be drawn, but we would certainly expect to find an etiology for a key Ptolemaic institution in this poem. Finally, I turn to the second source which ties Sesostris to the Serapis cult, the Alpha version of the Alexander Romance, which is dated to the 3rd or early 4th century CE, but which likely contains early material, at least in its first book. The passage in question comes during the long episode of Alexander's foundation of Alexandria, and this is passage 6 on the handout. Alexander sets out to fulfill instructions given to him by the god Ammon to find the God who sees all, and makes a sacrifice which is snatched up by an eagle, carried off, and placed on the altar of a very old temple with a male and female statue. Alexander eventually learns from Herodic inscriptions on obelisks by the temple that Sesostris, king of Egypt, ruler of the world, dedicated this to famous Serapis, god of the universe. Alexander demands to see the god, and he accordingly receives a dream from Serapis. This passage makes Alexander the refounder of the Serapis cult, as he discovered an old temple that seems to have fallen into disuse, since the locals do not know the god's true names, but only an approximation. Sesostris was the original founder, although the inscriptions on the obelisks do not specify whether he built the temple, the cult, the statue, or all three. The basic story of Alexander's discovery follows Greek foundation patterns. The refounder is instructed by a hexameter oracle, and a prophetic animal leads him to the right spot. While the oracular authority is Ammon, not Apollo, the oracle conflates the two by referring to Ammon as Phoebus with ram's horns. In both versions of the standard Serapis foundation story, the identity of the new god must be discovered, and no one authority can provide the correct answer. Here, the locals provide an answer that turns out to be half right. The correct identification is performed by Sesostris' hieratic inscriptions, in fact specified twice, which are full of the authority and confidence that comes from a voice from the past and old Egyptian writing. Another distinguishing feature of this narrative is Alexander's receptiveness. In many stories of the foundation of a Serapeum, the designated founder receives a dream from Serapis, ordering him to institute a cult, but the founder is slow to follow orders and needs to be encouraged. Alexander, however, does not need to be told twice. He is thus an ideal servant of the god. In short, this foundation narrative looks very different from the others we have been examining. It fits much better in the world of Hellenistic foundation stories, including those of the Seleucids. The dream Alexander receives from Serapis begins with a prose dialogue in which Serapis assures Alexander that his new city will not forsake his name and will prosper. Serapis then transitions into verse to inform Alexander about his future and expand on the coming glory of Alexandria in a selection that is printed at handout 7. In detailing the future prosperity of Alexandria, the god touches on several universal desiderata. The city will have beautiful buildings, a large population, and immunity from life's worst experiences. The language in which he does so, however, blends features that were characteristic of Alexandria in the Greco-Roman tradition with vocabulary and content that is particularly redolent of messianic prophecy and texts that have been identified as Greco-Egyptian versions of the Königsnobel form. I'm thinking in particular of the Oracle of the Potter, a prose narrative that is known from several Greek versions on papyrus, but is thought to represent a translation from a Demotic original. I would argue that the Sesostris variant of the Serapis foundation story may be in specific dialogue with a text like the Oracle. In the Alexander Romance, Serapis presents a vision of the glory that he will provide for the new city, which is opposed in detail by the wishes for Alexandria's total destruction expressed in the Oracle of the Potter. I mention the highlights here. First, many have recognized that the Potter's Oracle refers specifically, if obliquely, to Serapis when it faults Alexandria for molding new gods. Second, Serapis stresses that Alexandria will be adorned with architectural beauty, proliferation of cult, and a large population. The potter imagines how Alexandria will be depopulated, its gods will desert back to their Egyptian homes, and the city itself will become a drying place for fishermen. Finally, Serapis appears to preempt some of the ills hoped for by the potter. He claims that the city will grow over time with two synonymous expressions, kairon dipleiston kai chronon probainonton. Kairos is a word used for end times in many apocalyptic prophecies, and we may thus wonder whether Serapis is denying the possibility that apocalyptic collapse will occur in Alexandria. Serapis also assures Alexander that he will control the south wind, which is a reference to his regulation of the Nile flood, and thus, by extension, a guarantee against economic hardship and rebellion. To close, Serapis claims that Alexandria will be spared coming commotion, famine, plague, and war. The potter's oracle indeed imagines in detail how Alexandria will be plagued by these same ills. To those familiar with the work of our colleague John Dillery and others, it will come as no surprise that the Alexander Romance knows and interacts with Greco-Egyptian prophetic traditions like the potter's oracle. Indeed, in a piece I carelessly omitted from my bibliography, sorry about that, John points out how the end of the Armenian version of the Romance narrates how the voice of the divine Sesostris, that is, Sesostris, called out to forbid the burial of Alexander in Memphis, since his final resting place would be beset by war and turmoil, just as hoped for by the potter. It seems possible that different versions of the Romance preserve different kinds of prophecies about Alexandria. What can we conclude from this rather breathless survey of a variety of texts? I suggest that when combined, the four sources on the Serapis narrative that I have discussed can help us reconstruct a plausible lost foundation story that provides a coherent tale of an Egyptian statue returning to Alexandria. As we have seen from the foregoing discussion, all the primary sources for the Serapis cult stress or imply that the god statue was newly placed in an old temple in Alexandria. This suggests a story of return in the revival of an old or forgotten cult. In all four narratives, renewal is achieved through the production of a new cult statue for an old god and the action of a good king of Egypt, whether it be Sesostris, Alexander, or Ptolemy. I thus come back to statues returned from exile narrative pattern that can be completed if Sesostris, the founder of Colchis, was somehow responsible for the Serapis statue in nearby Sinope. Such a story might have contained the following elements. When Sesostris founded Colchis, the new city needed a cult. Because the city was populated by Egyptians, Sesostris dedicated a statue of Serapis, an old Egyptian god. Sesostris himself may have received a dream from the god while in Colchis or the greater Black Sea area, requiring him to build a statue in Sinope as well, that would eventually be returned to Egypt in a future political context Sesostris could not even imagine, that is, Ptolemaic Alexandria. He prophesies about Alexandria's illustrious future. Many centuries later, Ptolemy Soter receives a dream from Serapis demanding the return of his statue to Alexandria. Given the importance of delay and repeated dream commands in Zoilus's letter to Apollonius, it is likely that the king needed some convincing, as in Tacitus's account. The statue was, however, brought to Alexandria, perhaps after further delays in Sinope, as the locals did not want to give up the powerful statue. The statue returns to Alexandria and is celebrated accordingly. Indeed, the early Ptolemaic Python stele records a festival during which Egyptian priests identified statues which had been returned from abroad, and we might wonder whether there was a festival to welcome back the Serapis statue to Alexandria, whether in the foundation story or in reality. Of course, this is all speculation, but I do believe that the Herodotean fact of Sesostris' Colchian foundation may have facilitated a narrative of the Ptolemaic refoundation of the Serapis cult that followed the pattern of the statue in exile returning home. If so, we have here a Ptolemaic foundation narrative that was constructed from Egyptian cultural codes, but built around a fundamentally Greek core. The narrative of Sesostris and Sarapis' returning statue that I have reconstructed has the advantage of incorporating an important fact in the history of the Serapis cult, his origins in the Egyptian cult of Osiris in Memphis. It is possible that this story was meant to bring Egyptians into the fold of the Serapis cult by explaining that he was indeed a new incarnation of an old Egyptian divinity. Given what we know of the early Alexandrian worship of Serapis, 3 Ptolemaic moments might have found the Sesostris character particularly useful. The initial creation of the cult under Ptolemy I, the initial Ptolemaic diplomatic push into the Black Sea under Ptolemy II, and finally the refoundation of the Alexandrian Sarapis under Ptolemy III. All 3 early Ptolemies had reasons for claiming a connection with Sesostris as the ideal pharaoh, and the Greco-Egyptian historian Manetho, who wrote about Sesostris, may have lived and worked under all 3. In the final section of my paper, I briefly explore why the reign of Euergetes may have been a particularly productive time for Ptolemaic engagement with the Sesostris figure. If so, we may be able to link the more Egyptian foundation of Sesostris and Serapis's returning statue to Euergetes' refoundation of the Alexandrian Sarapis. First, the geographer Eratosthenes, who was invited to Alexandria by Ptolemy III and wrote an Egyptian-oriented geography of the world, marked the promontory on the African side of the entrance to the Red Sea with a stele left by Sesostris where he crossed over to Asia, and this is handout 9. While this rests on Herodotus's idea that Sesostris left stele that can help trace his path, Eratosthenes is the only source for a Sesostris stele in this region. If the pharaoh crossed into Arabia at the southernmost part of the Red Sea, he traveled through and presumably conquered the famously rich but notoriously inaccessible territory of the incense-producing Sabaean kingdom. He could thus serve as a model for control over a very important region of the Red Sea and Indian trade that was emerging in the Hellenistic period. It is further noteworthy that 2 references to Sesostris can be associated with Euergetes' attempt to reform the calendar that we learn about from the Canopus decree of 238 BCE. According to the decree, Euergetes added 1 day to the year every 4 years so that the seasons would not get out of sync with the calendar, and this new day was to be set aside for a festival of Euergetes and his wife Berenike II as the Theoi Euergetai. Building on her discovery that the many specific descriptions of the constellations throughout the narrative of Apollonius's Argonautica match the astronomical phenomena of the year 238 BCE, Jackie Murray suggests that Apollonius was commemorating and celebrating the beginning of Euergetes' new era of calendrical reform, and also activating the notion of a great year in which the cycle that the Argonauts began started anew in the reign of Ptolemy III. Another association between Sesostris, Euergetes, and the Great Year can be found in Tacitus's digression on the Phoenix in Annales 6. And this is passage 10 on the handout. It seems more than coincidence that Sesostris joins Amasis and Euergetes as the 3 Egyptian kings whose reigns witnessed an arrival of the Phoenix, especially since Sesostris appears in a shadowy but key point in the Argonautica, the poem which commemorated the new cycle. I'm not going to go into the arcane matters of the Phoenix year and the Great Year, but I will stress that Tacitus's 2 pharaonic figures bookend Herodotus's Egyptian king list. Thus, for a reader following Herodotus, and not, of course, Manetho, who pointedly corrects Herodotus's Egyptian timeline, Sesostris and Amasis represent the beginning and end of known Egyptian history. If they mark eras in this way, Euergetes might have plausibly marked a subsequent one. Could Ptolemy III have been particularly interested in associating himself with Sesostris? While the first 2 Ptolemaic kings might have had more need of foundation narratives, Euergetes may have begun to refine the strategies they pioneered. This may have entailed moving from the Greek myths about Egypt, such as Helen and Menelaus's Egyptian sojourn, to something a little more obscure or actually Egyptian, like the legend of Sesostris. The full potential of the Sesostris character within Ptolemaic literary culture may also have taken some time to develop. It may also have helped that, like Sesostris, Euergetes was a pharaoh who campaigned from Egypt to conquer Asia, getting all the way to the Euphrates in the Third Syrian War. If Euergetes did in fact combine Sesostris with the phoenix as a symbol of his calendrical reform, he was clearly able to both turn to well-established features of the Greek tradition of writing about Egypt, since the phoenix appears already in Herodotus, but also to employ much more technical knowledge of the bird's symbolism, which may derive from more detailed Egyptian knowledge. I thus suggest that the third Ptolemaic reign may have been a particularly appropriate moment for the creation of Greco-Egyptian foundation stories, and that the Herodotean Sesostris facilitated a way of looking at the Egyptian past that could fit easily into both Egyptian and Greek literary traditions. As such, the Sesostris legend offered culturally malleable material that could be coded more Greek or more Egyptian as the context demanded. I hope that the Hellenistic Sesostris can help us understand how Herodotus's Egyptian material was put to work by the Ptolemies, but also how the Ptolemaic use of Sesostris was received by their conquerors, the Romans. While the cultural flexibility allowed by the Herodotean Sesostris was useful in Hellenistic Egypt, the Roman reception of the foundation story of the Alexandrian Sarapis cult suggests that the less Egyptian narratives were deemed more meaningful for what we might call the canonical pan-Mediterranean culture of the Roman Empire. The Roman disinterest in the Greco-Egyptian Sesostris may be one reason why so few Hellenistic sources on the pharaoh survive. Yet the legacy of the Herodotean Sesostris did not end with the Ptolemies. It took on new textual forms and developed still further in works such as the Sesenkosis novel and the various versions of the Alexander Romance. The character that Herodotus brought from Egyptian literature to Greek was thus a lasting and ever flexible symbol of kingship. Thank you.